Good morning, Iowa. I'm Nick Learoff for Scott Casper, and this is St. Gregory's Talk Therapy, the mental health talk show. Join us as we talk about important topics that many Iowans face every single day, mental illness. We feature the expertise of doctors, therapists, specialists who understand the challenges we are facing. Our show airs 2 times, 4 to 5 a.m. and 10 to 11 a.m. Saturday mornings on Iowa's Hope 940 and online at talktherapytmhs.com. Join in for the conversation on this important life topic. As we like to say, Iowa, we're listening.
And so from the Five Talents Financial Management Studios, I am Scott Casper. He's Nick Learoff. And the dynamic duo is back at it again. Today, we're talking mental illness, mental health, and there's a whole lot of stuff going on. The topic this week, by the way, is grief. Now, death and grief are common human experiences, yet these experiences tend to be different for each of us. As a result, there are those professionals uniquely qualified to deal with grief and those experiencing grief of one kind or another. Our friends at Hamilton's Academy of Grief and Loss offer a wide variety of resources available to you and your family as you begin to work through your grief. How we deal with it, who's available for help, who might be experiencing grief. There's so many questions. And here to talk about it today, we'll have Jim Wilwarding from New Heights Counseling in the second part of the hour. But we start with the director of Hamilton's Academy of Grief and Loss, her name, Buffy Peters. She joins us now. Buffy, good morning. How are you?
Good morning, Scott. I'm good. How are you?
Good. Let's say hi to Nick here. He doesn't want to be left out.
Good morning.
Hi, Nick. How are you?
He's very needy.
I'm very good. Thank you so much for coming onto the show.
Yeah, absolutely.
All right, let's just dig right in. Okay, I want to drill down into, and we'll just ask some very specific questions, and then we'll get into more of the conversational aspect. Okay, Buffy, what is grief?
That is such a good question. That's actually the question we ask with each of our school groups that we do in schools. And grief is a lot of things, right? You all know if you've ever had someone special die, and we know that grief is the natural and normal reaction to loss. Typically, we think about that, of course, when somebody dies, but we know any change in our life causes grief. And I think especially now, living through a global pandemic in a year like 2020, we certainly realize that there's a lot of change, there's a lot of things that certainly can cause grief. And the thing that I always like people to know is that grief isn't just, my person died and now I feel sad. It affects every part of our being. It affects us emotionally, physically. I think that's one that really gets people when their grief is impacting them physically and they don't realize that the headaches, the stomach aches, the skin rash, like all of these different things that come out are part of their grief. It's psychological. It's so many pieces of who we are and really affects every part of our being.
So, Nick, you and I talk frequently about certain aspects of what St. Gregory's provides. The folks that choose St. Gregory's as a place where they can become, one with their spirituality, something that they may have been grieving for, and they didn't know it. Perhaps they have a substance abuse problem. And then you take that away from them, guess what? Grief.
All those emotions and all those feelings and things start coming back. And, it's interesting when you start going through a timeline with somebody, if they do what we call like a life narrative, where they'll go through and they are talking about all the things they experienced in their life. And then they connect that with when their substance use, started to really get a hold of them or really start to go off on the deep end, if you will. And, it's amazing when you start pulling that stuff apart and just looking at it from a 30,000 foot view and say, well, this is you experienced this loss, at this age or at this time frame. And look, 2-3 months later, that's when that drinking started happening. And that person probably thought, oh, well, I dealt with that. I have acceptance with that. And maybe that's just, it's underneath the skin, I guess, as you, something that they maybe haven't fully resolved to a certain point where they have gained that full acceptance, and it's still affecting them to this day.
Buffy Peters, our guest, director of Hamilton's Academy of Grief and Loss. Without getting into names and all that, but my family has suffered a loss recently. A very dear person to our entire family, a member of our family, and everybody I think in the family is dealing with it differently. Mm-hmm. I know my wife, who was very close to him, just absolutely broke down and sobbed and sobbed. There was nothing that I'm certainly going to be understanding, but there's nothing I could say or really do. She needed to vent. She needed to express her deep felt emotions. And Buffy, being in the business that you are, I gotta believe you see all sorts of examples of people and the way they deal with the grief, especially in your case, dealing with loved ones that have lost or that are lost. Yeah.
Yep. Yeah. And I think that's one of the misconceptions with grief is that we all grieve the same, or because I grieved a death this way, that's how everyone else is going to grieve. And as you very well know, Scott, just from your current example, we all grieve differently. Mm-hmm. And even when we think about if I'm angry about a situation, my anger and how I exhibit that is very different than, someone else in my family. And so we work a lot with kids, we work a lot with families, and that's kind of part of that conversation is that, hey, if my brother's not crying all the time, that doesn't mean that he's sad or that he's, grieving for that person, and vice versa. Sometimes we'll get calls like, oh, well, one of my kids, our family had this death, and one of our kids, she's doing really well. She's focusing in school, and she's, doing all the things she's supposed to do, and the other one is acting out. Well, that doesn't mean the one that, quote unquote, is doing well isn't grieving and couldn't use that support. And so I think that's really important for people to know. And also, we know that grief is a lifelong thing. Just because the funeral is over doesn't mean our grief is over. And love is at the root of that grief. And so as long as you love that person, you're going to grieve for that person, and that's okay. The old adage was, you get over it, you are over it in a certain amount of time, you don't talk about it, and that's just not really healthy coping. Part of grief is figuring out, how do I continue to live without my person, but how do I continue that bond? And that's the thing. Back in the day, continuing that bond was seen as maladaptive. And we know that it's completely adaptive and is really actually helpful when most people realize, like, oh, I don't have to stop talking about my person. I don't have to pretend that they never existed.
Right.
That's the healthy thing. And so when we can, come to terms with the emotions we're feeling, find healthy ways to get those out, we can get to the point where we're honoring that life, and that's where it's at. There's still going to be good and bad days, come 15, 16, 20 years later, because we're always going to love that person. They're always a part of who we are, and that's okay, and that's healthy.
And that's what I think that's the very intention of the show, not just this episode, but the entirety of it, is that we're dealing with health, and that is a healthy mind, body, and soul. Loss is something that and is the human condition uniquely able to? I hesitate to use the term bounce back, but to deal with grief are humans uniquely capable, or is that spread across the spectrum of the animal kingdom?
We see animals grieve after either a pet has died or a person has died. I think that's one of the most heartbreaking things is watching the dog come in to say goodbye to their human. I don't know what it is about it. Absolutely breaks my heart. But the thing is if we do have that support and we can find those healthy outlets, we can get to a point where I honestly believe that when someone really significant in your life dies and they're no longer a part of your life, you change too.
Oh, yeah.
And it's that adage, that when my person died, a part of me died too. And so we're different. And that's okay. It's okay to be different after that loss, because their love and who they were in your life changed you. And of course, their death is going to change you too. And so it's really about finding good ways to cope with that I do think a lot of people are resilient. And you do see a lot of post-traumatic growth where people are finding, you know what, I would give anything for this to not have happened, but it did. And now I want to help other people. I can say that from my personal experience. My best friend died when I was 21, and it was the lack of support that I didn't get. I didn't know what to do with me. But, my school didn't know what to do with me. My friends were like, oh my gosh, what is going on? And because of that, I wanted to help other people not feel so alone and let them know, you might feel like, oh my gosh, my world's falling apart and I don't even know what's going on.
Right.
But you will get through this. It doesn't feel like it right now, but you will, and you'll get to the day where you can laugh and think of those fun memories and really be able to honor that person, even though it doesn't feel like it right now.
Buffy, we're going to take a quick time out. We're going to invite you to stay through it. There's some other questions I want to get to with you, and I know Nick does as well. But You're listening to St. Gregory's Talk Therapy, the mental health show from the Five Talents Financial Management Group studios. It's Learhoff and Casper and our very special guest, Buffy Peters, director of Hamilton's Academy of Grief and Loss. Look for them online at hamiltonsfuneralhome.com, and you'll find a whole bunch of resources there. She's done an outstanding job of assemblage, but more than anything, it's there and there's no charge. I think that speaks to the heart of it all, right? No charge, because they actually do care about more than just the funeral, the burial, etc. There's so much more that they deal with, and that's what I find endearing about Hamilton's. You took care of my mother. You took care of my uncle. You took care of my cousin. You took care of my brother-in-law. You've taken care of so many members of my family. And you know what? Go to the website, folks. You don't need to be planning a funeral. Let's say you're dealing with COVID. I don't want to end for the next segment, okay? But let's say you're dealing with COVID. There is a COVID-19 update there. I think you'll find very informative. We'll be back after this. You're listening to Hope 940. Stay tuned.
Stay tuned. There's more with Nick Learhoff and Scott Casper right here on Iowa's 940 for St. Gregory's Talk Therapy, the mental health show. Iowa, we're listening.
I came to St. Gregory very reluctantly at my all-time worst, physically, emotionally, and mentally. But I gave my best effort to these new things in my life as I saw hope in this complete approach. I'm at the point now that I feel my strongest and best ever, physically, mentally, and emotionally. I felt quite certain God was orchestrating everything.
St. Gregory Recovery Center. Recovery starts here. RelevantRadio.com/St. Gregory.
Welcome back. This is Nick Learhoff and Scott Casper with St. Gregory Talk Therapy, the mental talk show. We are with Buffy Peters, the director from Hamilton's Grief and Loss.
That's a big title.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? It covers a lot of ground, and she rejoins us now. Buffy, why the field of grief? I mean, grief field as a profession, that's pretty darn specific, and it's also... It leads, I think the question is, why the field? I mean, it's very challenging emotionally, I would imagine.
It is. But when you're passionate about what you do, I think you guys know that too. When you have that passion, it's all you can do to want to help other people. And like many in the grief field, I have my own personal losses that really formed me wanting to help other people.
Mm-hmm.
My first death was when I was 10 years old and my grandma died.
Okay.
And she was one of my people. She was showing up to my violin concerts, all of those things. And when she died, it was really devastating for me. And I was actually able to take part in a school grief group, which was pretty rare back in, the early 90s. And so that kind of formed that. And I knew I always wanted to help people. I just didn't know what that meant. I didn't have a whole lot of guidance, like this is what you should do when you grow up. So I was in college at Iowa State, and it was my senior year, and my best friend was murdered. And
Oh, wow.
I was devastated, lost, like in complete agony. It was the worst time of my entire life. And I was a young adult. and I had to go to class, and I had to try and figure out, how do you live in this world that your best friend is gone? She was like my cheerleader. She was the one that got me to go to Iowa State. She believed in me when I didn't believe in myself. And now I just didn't know what to do. And
it's a violent departure.
Exactly. And that traumatic grief, my friends were like, "Oh no, Buffy, I know just how you feel because, my uncle died of cancer." And I'm like, "I'm sorry for that your uncle died, but that's totally different."
Yeah.
Totally different. And so it was, they didn't know what to do with me. They were trying their best. And just like you said, Scott, earlier, we want to say the words to take the pain away. And I know that even me, I don't have the words to take that person's pain away. And it's really about that process and finding the people that can support you, that can be uncomfortable with you and just be there. And because I didn't have that support, once I kind of came out of that first few years of the fog where you're just like on autopilot, trying to get through the day, trying to figure out ways to cope and trying those different things, that I really decided, I want to be able to help people who are grieving. The hard part is the field's very small. And so when I actually went back to Iowa State to get my degree in child, adult, and family services, so I could at least go into the human service field and help, I toured Hamilton's as a student, and I, posted on Facebook and said, "Oh my gosh, this would be my dream job." And there was one person that worked there, and, it's a super long shot, of course. And then here I am. I graduated in 2012, went back to school at 28, and here I am as the director. It's a complete dream come true.
That's a whole different kind of grief, by the way, when you're 28 going back to school. I did the same.
Mm-hmm.
And you are grieving over all that lost time. Sure, you learned something along the way, but there's a different kind of grief. Well, I'm sad for your loss in that a tragic loss when there's violence.
Mm-hmm.
There's fear, I would imagine, that plays into the emotions and the not knowing was the person's and I don't want to get in too deep if you don't want to, but was the person ever caught that committed the?
Yeah, so it was a pretty big story in Des Moines. It was in 2004, and it was in January. She was house sitting. Her name is Sarah Dalkey. She was house sitting for a family that she worked with, the woman who lived in the house, and they needed a house sitter going on vacation, so she was house sitting for them, and their 16-year-old was still there. And he ended up getting angry with her. She told him he couldn't have a party, and he shot and killed her. And then 2 days later, when the police Greg Gall had come to check on him because he was his counselor. Greg actually started LifeWorks on 42nd Street. He was one of the people who founded that. And so he went to go check on them, got there before the police. The kid shot and killed Greg as well, so it was a double homicide. And then they ended up catching up with the kid that killed them, and he ended up, shooting himself and killing himself in the car. So we were lucky in the aspect that, her body was there. We knew, she was, at least there, and that we didn't have to go through a trial and all of that. And of course, now we hear about, different governments wanting to suspend 16-year-old sentences because they were too young, for life sentences and things like that. So like you said, there's sometimes those silver linings that at least, I hate to say the at least, but as the griever, I can say at least we didn't have to go through all of that and, probation hearings. And I mean, I hear horror stories from other homicide survivors that you can say, okay, well, at least in our situation, we didn't have to deal with that. And I'm still very close with her family, and I go to dinner with her parents every anniversary of her death. And they're very special people to me. And it's anything I can do to make that horrible, terrible situation something that can help other people. That's a real privilege and honor for me. And I know that Sarah would be very proud of what I've been able to do with my life and to continue to live it in honor of her, because she didn't get that. And, for me, that's the least I can do.
Yeah, absolutely. And a question for you, Buffy, too. At that, going through that at that time and how traumatic and that what that whole situation is. What were some of the things that helped you during that time, going through some of that?
Yeah, it was so hard. I'm a writer. I love writing. And poor Iowa State, I was in all these creative writing classes. So my student, like the other students, the teacher, I'm basically pouring my heart out in these papers, and they don't know what to do with it. They're just like, I guess this gets an A because, like, how do you grade something just so heartfelt and broken and all of those things?
Raw.
So raw. And they were wonderful. They tried their best with me, but writing has always been one of my outlets that has really helped. For me too, it's been being active, and running has been something that's been a lifesaver through a lot of hard things in my life. And I first started running when I went out for soccer because Sarah talked me into it. And so there's so many parts of me that kind of started because of her. And so that helps me feel connected. Again, being close to her family has been really helpful because nobody else quite gets it like we do. And I do have friends that were friends with her. And so spending time with them, of course, helps. And I think for me, the turning point was because I was being told, Buffy, she wouldn't want you to be so sad. Why are you not over this yet? We want the old Buffy back. And knowing inside me that that girl was gone,
Yeah.
for me, it was when I learned I didn't have to let go of that bond with Sarah. I didn't have to let go of her. And that's when I started volunteering for Amanda the Panda here in Des Moines. And I was a camp counselor, and I usually worked with kind of the 3rd through 5th grade kids. And
how much do we love Buffy right now?
Buffy.
God.
Yeah, well, it was
Wow.
so much fun, too, and to be with these kids who, have been through so much at such a young age. And I still remember my first kid that was a homicide survivor, and me just sharing my story and the relief that she had, that she's finally met someone else who's had someone die that way. Like, it was such a game changer for her. And again, if I could do anything to help someone not feel alone, like, I can't take that pain away, but I know what that pain feels like, and it might be different for you, but that's all I can ask.
Shared burden, right? I mean, we're all going through a shared experience of COVID-19.
Exactly.
About 3 minutes remain in our segment with you, Buffy, and we gave you the first half of the hour. I want to do this again, and I want you to think about what direction you want to take the next time we have you on, because this is a big, and believe me, it's way more than an hour, surely more than a half hour. But in closing with you, and I'm going to ask this of our next guest as well, how is grieving like pruning? That's what, in my research, I came up with this idea that grieving is like pruning, and I just got done pruning back all my tomato plants and all that, and cleaning up the deck, where I did all my growing this year. But how is it like grieving? How is grieving like pruning?
Yeah, what a good question. I think about when someone is in their deep grief and that beginning part, and you think about, my life just fell apart in front of me. Like, there's all of these pieces that I don't even know what to do with. And we know whenever you feel overwhelmed by something, you have to start somewhere. And so I think when you have that intention of, what, this little piece I can start picking up, this little piece I can do something with. And so feeling like, what, I know what to do with my tomato plant. I can trim these little edges off. I can prune that. And at least that's something that I accomplished. And we tell people too, especially when you're in that point where, like, I can't get out of bed, I don't know what to do with myself. If you can start small, that can be really helpful.
Right.
And trying to find those things that you're grateful for. And I think too, the thing that we're really attuned with right now, knowing that the pandemic is so difficult on all of us, we're all grieving. There's so much trauma. and toxic stress and all of that going on right now. And then we add the death of someone, and now we have the holidays coming up. And knowing that that's all really hard too, the biggest thing that I just want to make sure that your listeners know too is that there is support available. Sure. We have things coming up to help with the holidays. We have a Coping with Grief Symposium. There's support groups that are meeting right now, either virtually or maybe in person. So please know that just because things are very weird in the land of 2020, there is support available. So please reach out. Like Scott said, go to the website. There's a lot of really great information. Feel free to reach out. We're here to support you in any way that we can.
You be careful. We may become best friends. I got to tell you.
We might.
I'm loving everything I'm hearing, and we'll do it again. But be in touch with me as well.
Yes.
We're going to put you down as a resource on our resource tab. I know Danny will be all over that. But yes. HamiltonsFuneralHome.com, that's where you're going to find Buffy and the Academy of Grief and Loss. Buffy, it's been a pleasure. We'll look forward to doing it again real soon, okay?
Yes, thank you guys. Have a good rest of your day.
There we go. There's proof positive. You do not have to grieve alone. We're going to take a quick time out. We'll have more on our special topic today, and that is dealing with grief and the variety of types of grief. We're only going to scratch the surface for sure, but Jim Wellwording is coming up. New Heights Counseling Resources. He's not just a licensed mental health counselor, but he's also certified in alcohol and drug counseling. And you heard President Trump in the debate last night talk about the incidence of alcoholism and substance abuse skyrocketing. Because people are dealing with this grief, that they're missing their family, they're missing their friends, they're missing their normal everyday activities. We'll talk about that and more with Jim and you on the other side of the break. You're listening to St. Gregory's Talk Therapy, the mental health show with Nick Learhoff and yours truly, Scott Casper. Stay tuned. More on the other side, only on Hope 940.
St. Gregory's Talk Therapy, the mental health show, will continue after this commercial timeout.
The folks at St. Gregory were vital in helping me to get my brother into rehab. They were not only supportive of him, but of our whole family. They truly saved all of our lives with their love and kindness. Because of the hard work they helped my brother do, we regained a valued, healthy, and incredible part of our family. From the bottom of my heart, thank you.
RelevantRadio.com/St. Gregory, setting the new standard for recovery.
All right, welcome back. St. Gregory's Talk Therapy, the mental health show, live from the Five Talents Financial Management Group studios. And you hear us talk about Five Talents Financial Management Group, and I will tell you this, Don Boyd and his talented team can help you realize goals. Let's help you set goals. They will help you realize your goals. And make sure that they're realistic. I mean, setting goals that you'll never be able to hit, no matter how far out, it doesn't make any sense. Let the guys that do this for a living, let them help you. Five Talents Financial Management Group. They're a presenting sponsor of our studios, and we're awfully proud to know them. Don Boyd, a dear friend of mine, he's been taking care of my family for years, and he can take care of yours too. Our topic today, Nick, grief and loss. And we just enjoyed, I think, a rather eye-opening conversation with Buffy Peters, the director of Hamilton's Academy of Grief and Loss. Our next guest is making a return appearance on the program, a licensed mental health counselor, a certified alcohol and drug counselor, a national certified counselor, whose educational background is really phenomenal. And he's, I think, especially with the, if you think about St. Gregory's, he's very uniquely qualified to deal with what we're dealing with now as a community of people. And I'm talking about COVID-19. Jim Wellwording joins the program. Jim, welcome back. How are you?
Good to be back, Scott. Thanks for having me again. And Nick, doing well this morning. Thanks. All
right. So grief is what, the core topic of this particular episode. And COVID is, I was very surprised during the debate last night to hear Donald Trump, the president, speak to what we know is happening, okay? Increased alcohol sales in the state of Iowa up 270%, okay? Increased alcohol sales translates into I'm not sure what the percentage is, but alcoholism, substance abuse, I would imagine in some instances death. There's a lot going on here, a lot of moving parts. And Jim, there's no real easy answer, is there?
There really is not. And as you said, partly because there is so many moving parts. And, I think one of the challenges is trying not to make all of the moving parts into too simple of a model, but then also not to get overwhelmed by the model, I guess.
Well, you went to a great school in St. Thomas, by the way.
Well, thank you.
I dated a girl from St. Kate's. You remember St. Kate's?
Just down the road there, yep.
Yeah, and my ear will forever be affected by the accident that took place at Grandin Snelling up in St. Paul's. I'm a huge fan of St. Thomas, St. Kate's, and that whole area of the Twin Cities. But the reason I bring that up is because it holds a great place in my heart. When I had to leave the Twin Cities, I was grieving. I didn't know why. Okay, I expected a lot of the community I went to. My first big job in radio outside of WCCO in Minneapolis was in Creston, Iowa, KSIB, KITR, AM, FM Country. This is a place that still had shag carpeting on the walls and on the floor. Orange shag carpeting. And it was there until about 1989 or 1990. So that tells you how long ago. Anyway, I was grieving departing Minneapolis, and nobody really could understand what I was going through. My family surely didn't. They understood that I was different. And in dealing with my father, okay, who is, for the most part, spending most of his days alone, even though there are many others in the assisted living place that he lives, that are going through the exact same thing. At 88 years old, you're pretty well set in your ways, but you're still grieving everything that was normal. He could not celebrate the life of my mother on the anniversary of her death on the 17th of October in the way he would like to have. No, instead he went and got a COVID test. And he couldn't leave until he got the results several days later. But Jim, we're being challenged right now, perhaps more in the modern era than ever before. Would you agree with that?
I would agree with that. And you raised a good point there, Scott, about grieving and grief and how any change, any loss, right, brings about grief. And I'm sure your previous guest probably talked a lot about that. But and I think sometimes it's that misunderstood part is like, well, why are you grieving? You just got this promotion. Well, I'm grieving the loss of my team, right? I mean, the people I used to work with. Gosh, it's your first big break there, Scott. I'm sure Creston was, right? And
yeah, that's what I thought it was.
So why could you be down? And I think so often grief is that hidden piece that so many people are experiencing. And sometimes you talk about COVID, sometimes the general things or things that people go through as a community, right? We're all kind of in this together, as the saying goes. So we should feel like we shouldn't be grieving, because, well, lots of other people are going through this too. And I think that's also kind of leads folks to not name the grief. And if you don't name it, you can't, claim it and tame it, as they say.
I think it's interesting, you talk about the, what all grief could entail. It's not just that, particularly like a death of a loved one. I mean, I think about even just like the teenage years, right? And you have your first love, if you will, and you're in the puppy love stage or whatever. And, basically the idea of like their first heartbreak, right? I think everybody's probably experienced that once or twice in their life, but the grief or the loss of that, when you feel like your heart just is broken in half from that relationship or that first love, I mean, it can really be anything, like just to kind of piggyback on what you were saying, Jim, that people can experience that loss and it could just grip them so hard. My
first girlfriend, and I will share this with you because it's truly a heartwarming story, even though there is a whole lot of grief involved and grieving. We're still friends. She's on husband number 5, and she's known both my ex-wife and my wife. We've known all of the husbands. But her mother said something I think, and our families grew very close, as you might guess, from 16 to now in my advanced years, that we're still close. But her mother said something strange as she was dying of cancer. She said, she's still looking for you. And I went, wow. So the mother was grieving the fact that I wasn't her son. And I'm thinking secretly, you are so lucky, But Pam and I have come to an understanding that any mistakes and breaks in that relationship early were really life learning steps, right? I mean, this is how we grow as people. Can we even, in our 50s and 60s, can we still say that, the grief process is a part of growth?
I would certainly say that. I mean, I think where oftentimes we see people get stuck so often, at least in my experience, and Nick, maybe you see it too, is people get stuck in grief. They haven't processed their grief. They haven't let go of that first love. They haven't moved past that. They haven't learned the lessons that can come from that loss or that change. And then they're just kind of stuck there. And, I often subscribe to the theory that people are more stuck than sick for the most part, in as much as it's usually something gets jammed up there, or it's, maybe I'm a big fan of processing grief through rituals. If I haven't ritualized those anniversaries or those new holiday experiences or whatever, it's like the time just stopped the day that the person died, or the day that the change made, or, the new team is never going to be as good as the old team, or the new spouse is never going to be as good as that one that I got away. Right.
Right. It's interesting. I mean, like even at, you say St. Gregory's, like people who are going through a divorce, or, divorce caused the drinking, or the drinking caused the divorce. Which comes first, the chicken or the egg, right? But those folks that they kind of get caught up in that what once was, and what's changed, and the loss in that regard, and like you said, then they try to find, that way to cope or that way to manage, which turns to the substances, and it's just that vicious cycle. When you look at grief, Jim, I guess a question I kind of was thinking about, or I guess just I want to get your perspective on it, is like, what are the different feelings that people experience when they associate it with the grief process?
I think probably the one that is the most pervasive that gets overlooked is the feeling of isolation. Because nobody else is going through this. Nobody had the same relationship as the person who died as I did. Not exactly, right? Even though I might have siblings, when my parent died, they had a different relationship with my parent than I did. And so that isolation, I think, also leads to the feelings of sadness, feelings of maybe kind of just disorientation might be another way to put it. I don't know how to navigate the world without this person, or I don't know how to navigate the world in this new scenario. I don't know how to sit in a studio with orange shag carpet on the walls, right? And that disorientation, I think, leads to feelings of helplessness and hopelessness that we kind of often associate with that sadness of grief. My loving wife, who, by the way, I definitely married up, guys. I mean, she keeps me being my best self all the time.
I got news for you. Most of us guys do marry up.
Well, yeah, there you go, right?
It's a two-edged sword. Women are making bad decisions.
But she said, we were at a funeral of a friend of ours that died very tragically, and she said, it's hard to just look out of the street and know that all these people are just going about their day, and they don't realize this is such a cataclysmic day in our life.
No, and I think of that scenario in itself is, we're all going through different things at different times, and it's so much to me, and what we kind of talk about at St. Gregory's, it's all about perspective in a certain sense of a lot of times people come in and they've gone through different loss and traumatic events, and they want to stay stuck there. It seems like, and so it's how do we get out of that whole, how do we, and I don't want to use the word move on, but how do we learn to accept the loss that we've experienced?
All right. We got to take a quick time out. Jimmy, hold the line if you would, please. No, it's okay. Jimmy and Scotty and Nikki. We're just all buddies. Listen, we're talking about grief. It doesn't have to be sad. It can be informative. It can be educational. It can be part of growth. And that's the purpose of the topic of our show today. And I hope you're enjoying it. I invite you to go grab another cup of coffee, maybe a hot or a cold tea, but sit back and kind of internalize what we're talking about. You're listening to St. Gregory's Talk Therapy, the mental health show with Scott Casper and Nick Learhoff. Danny Bishop, our producer. As always, we appreciate you listening only on Hope 940. Stay tuned. There's more after this short timeout.
Stay tuned. There's more with Nick Learhoff and Scott Casper right here on Iowa's 940 for St. Gregory's Talk Therapy, the mental health show. Iowa, we're listening.
My dad went to AA once, decided it wasn't for him, and refused to ever go back. He was stubborn and confident that he was just okay. But he wasn't okay, and our family was suffering. So we had an intervention for him, and he agreed to go to St. Gregory Recovery Center. There he learned how to deal with his addiction the way he needed. Insurance covered our costs, and he has been sober now for over 4 years. Learn more at relevantradio.com/recovery.
Welcome back. This is Nick Learhoff and Scott Casper with St. Gregory's Talk Therapy, the mental health talk show. And we are with Jim Wilwarding from New Heights Counseling, talking a little bit about grief and loss today.
You, Jimmy, you had sent over some, some good questions, I thought. But the process of grief, as you stated, and some might use the word stage, but the process is it a process model? Is there an actual model that you could look at and say, well, that's how it fits, that's how I fit in, or this is how it's affecting me? Is that something, is it simple as that?
Well, I think that's why a lot of folks like the stages model, either, the kind of the most famous one, the Elizabeth Kubler-Ross stages model, where folks can identify like, okay, I'm in this stage, right? And I just kind of, my thought is, there really isn't a to say I'm moving from, now I'm moving from anger to bargaining or whatever. To me, the process really is kind of just more fluid than that. It's, probably recognizing I'm feeling whatever I'm feeling today, and how does that tie to my grief, and how do I express that feeling? Because, as we know, and we talk about 1,000 times, any feeling that's not expressed gets suppressed, and then we get depressed, right? I mean, try to throw a little poetry there in the morning, but
that's beautiful.
But I think, and I think so. I think from the processing standpoint, it really is about saying, okay, how do I acknowledge the feelings that I have, and try not to judge them as, is this the right feeling to have, or is this not, or but I think for some folks that stage helps put some of that framework around that to say, okay, I'm feeling like this is completely unreal, right? Okay, now I know where I am. But I think where we get locked in is if folks want to say, well, now I have to move to the next stage, as opposed to, even Kubler-Ross said, these stages don't happen in order, and you can repeat the stages often. But I think, to kind of for folks to give themselves, I always say, give yourselves at least a year, because you need to get through all the firsts, right? Mm-hmm. The first holidays without the person, or with, in a new situation, the first anniversaries, the first birthdays, all the firsts. We have to kind of prove to ourselves that we can get through that. So that's kind of my thought on the processing part, or the, process is more, it probably doesn't have a discrete starting point other than maybe the change or the death, and doesn't necessarily have a absolute end point. Nobody can say, well, now I'm done.
I suppose it's probably very similar to like when you talk about the stages of change in itself. It's not a linear process. It's like you said, it's very fluid. You're going kind of in and out of the stages, if you will, or the process of grief, just like you go in and out of the stages of change in a certain sense, because, the loss that we experienced is a change in itself. We're trying to maneuver through that change and understand it, how could this happen, and all the different feelings and things that we're trying to work through as we go through that change or that loss, and which is causing the grief.
Right.
And I think also, kind of piggyback on that, what folks I think sometimes want to say is the biggest feelings are right when the loss happens or right after the loss happens, and then the feelings start to almost like it's a funnel, right? So where now we're getting the smaller and smaller and smaller. I might flip that on its head and say, really, when we experience some kind of significant loss, the significance of that loss gets bigger and bigger over time. It's missing that person at key moments, right? Gosh, I wish my mom would be here for the, wedding of my child, right? But, now, I wish this person would be here. And it's really that recognizing the impact of the ripple effect of that loss. I think, it goes out rather than in.
I want to bring up, and this is a different type of grieving, but let's say you have somebody you idolize and he happens to be a prize fighter. Okay. Mm-hmm. And everything you do, everything you believe in him, okay, is on the line every time he goes into the octagon and fights. And I'm talking, of course, about my buddy Randy Couture. And when he would lose, he always it rolled off his back, where the fans took it, I think, even more serious than he did, or at least outward appearances, right? But we were grieving the loss because it was almost like, well, your hero has just been defeated. But he said something very real to me once, and I don't know where it came from, and I guess maybe I should ask him. Maybe I'll have him on the show. But the idea is that everybody's going to lose sometime, okay? But to make it a habit, okay, that's what you struggle in everything. I mean, his career in motion pictures and whatnot, he's doing very well in life. And his few losses that he's had, he's not grieving those. He might for a moment, but then he moves on and plans for the next step in his career. But I think that it's kind of a mirror of what life really is, or a microcosm look of the macrocosm, right? I mean, if we take look at what we're dealing with as a community of humans, okay, the human condition right now, it's not as much a mess as I think the media would like to paint it. I think we're all going through pretty much the same thing. How we deal with it, that's the departure. Am I selling that short, Jim, or is that about right?
I think that's about right. I mean, it really is, not just about what happened. It's about how we process that, how we go through that, how we adapt.
Adaptation is huge. And Nick, you deal with it so often with St. Gregory's, and I'm not talking about individuals, but the whole concept, the whole idea is, I bet you anything you're missing your spirituality. I bet you anything you're missing sobriety, in that you don't have the ability to think clearly. Your body is not capable of functioning because of the alcohol that's replaced blood or water that makes up the human body. But we grieve things that we miss. You take away the alcohol, guess what? We're going to grieve that, because we're so used to the ingestion of the alcohol, right? And we're also, I think, grieving the way the alcohol made you feel.
Well, I mean, and it kind of gets back to the different models of addiction, and the idea that people are using the substances to numb themselves from whatever it is they're feeling.
I did.
So a lot of times people come in, if they come in heavily intoxicated or, high, as you will, it for the first, week and a half, they're just kind of starting to kind of get clear. But then as they get clearer, the emotions become realer, they become more real. And so it's one of those things where we see this a lot, where then once those emotions and the things that they were suppressing start coming back, then they just, I need to go get drunk again because I don't want to feel these things. That's why I'm drinking. And so it's a matter of just helping them as those emotions and things start coming back, to work through and process and help them keep focused on the future of moving in a different direction, so they're not just getting back into the cycle again.
Jim Wilwarding, our guest, New Heights Counseling Resources. Jim, what do you want the listeners to take away from your being on the show? You got about a minute and a half.
All right. Well, I think for everybody to just, I would say, look for the grief. Mm-hmm. When you're feeling down, when you're feeling kind of disoriented, look for the grief. What am I missing? What am I missing out on, or what am I losing here? And then finding a way to really find the support that you need. Folks who can be empathetic. We didn't talk too much about empathy, but folks who can really just understand the loss because they themselves have had loss, or just because they are supportive of you as a person. And really to not try to succumb to the isolated feelings. We don't have to do grief alone. We don't have to do life alone. So, find a way to connect with folks and work through the feelings, because all the feelings are just all the feelings.
They're valid.
They get to be, every one of them. So
you bet. And Jim, you're valid as well. How about that?
I appreciate the validation.
Yeah,
Thank you, Scott.
You nailed it, dude. New Heights Counseling Resources. You'll find that under our resources tab. Danny Bishop now fully in control of said website. Danny, we appreciate that. Jim, always good to have you on. We'll do it again soon. I promise you that.
Sounds good. Thanks, guys.
New Heights Counseling Resources. They'll talk to you and talk to you about what you're going through. We appreciate you joining us each and every week right here at the St. Gregory's Talk Therapy Mental Health Show. Why? Because we think that mental illness and mental health is not just worthy of being talked about, it's worthwhile. I think they're really two totally different things that are intertwined. But I think it's important that we have the discussion each and every week. Nick, I know you feel the same way. St. Gregory's most definitely does. And I know Danny Bishop does as well. So for Danny Bishop, Nick Learhoff, I'm Scott Casper, thanking you for listening. You have been listening to St. Gregory's Talk Therapy, the Mental Health Show. Look for us online at talktherapytmhs.com.